Good afternoon. Turkey moves northeast backing the YPG and joining me, the National Crisis Group. And her report on northeast Syria has just been published, which analyzes the latest developments in northeastern Syria. Hi, Darin. Thank you very much for joining us.
Merhaba, Ayşen. Thank you so much for having me.
The latest news is that the Trump administration has yet to find a middle ground between Turkey and YPG. I mean, months of diplomatic talks between Turkey and the US remain deadlocked. And I think it doesn't surprise you, since in your report you also argue that Washington cannot do this. I mean, in a dilemma that is, Washington either can protect YPG or strengthen its ties with Turkey, but it cannot.
Absolutely, Ayşen. We at ICG have been arguing for years now that Washington's dilemma is that it is trying to address a political problem between the YPG and Turkey through short-term stopgap military fixes. This dilemma has only started a few months ago when talks about a safe zone started. It started actually years ago when they were discussing the Manbij roadmap and the possibility of pulling out YPG senior cadres from the city of Manbij and Aleppo. Washington is now facing a sort of self-inflicted dilemma in that regard, because throughout its war, the course of its anti-ISIS war in Syria, it sort of midwifed the creation of what today looks a lot like a YPG-led statelet in northeastern Syria. Today, if you look at the map, the area that the YPG controlled is almost 30% of Syria. It is 5 times the size of a country like Lebanon. The self-administration, the YPG-led self-administration, employs over 140,000 employees. It's a military group that has around 60,000 fighters. It looks a lot like a statelet. So from Ankara's perspective, the increasing influence of the YPG in northeastern Syria is quite threatening to their national security. And for years now, Ankara has been arguing that Washington needs to address its core concerns. The problem now is the talks over a potential safe zone have really clarified that the bottom lines between the YPG and Ankara are just so wide, it is impossible for Washington to find a middle ground without addressing the heart of these problems. So today, yeah.
Yeah, I'm hearing you. Sorry, I'm listening to you. Sorry.
No, what I was going to say is basically Washington can basically try to continue to pursue the exact same policy it has been pursuing for the last few years when they put forward the Manbij roadmap, when they established observation posts on the Syria-Turkey border. But that will address the problem, it's a short-term fix for the problem. It will address the immediate concern of a potential Turkish incursion in northeastern Syria, but it will not be a sustainable. His military and his State Department are trying to find a formula that would convince him of prolonging the drawdown process. But no one has been able to convince him of an indefinite presence in northeastern Syria. So Washington is adamant about leaving Syria, but they also want to continue to protect their YPG allies. And they do want to salvage their relations with Turkey. And doing that through short-term military fixes is it's very problematic and it's not sustainable. Instead, Washington should use its remaining leverage in Syria, and they should use their time is ticking, and they should use their presence to address the heart of the political conundrum between the YPG and Turkey.
You really good analyze it very thoroughly, and as you put it in your report, and also as you tell now, that a buffer zone is not a viable solution. But you also say that the immediate priority should be, trying to find trying to go inside the political problem, and maybe for U.S. to secure an arrangement between YPG and Turkey, it sounds even more difficult to achieve at the moment, but you have also put in your report some terms for such an agreement which could be used by United States. Could you tell us a little bit more? How can it start, or from which point it could start?
No, absolutely. I mean, none of the solutions we have today are easy. But, I mean, we were trying to put forward some arrangements that we could think could be mutually tolerable by both the YPG and Ankara, and can also sustain the protection of the area. One of these things, and it's also an issue that Crisis Group has been advocating for, is the issue of the foreign PKK-related cadres in Syria. Ankara has been continuously arguing that there are...
Sorry, we have a problem.
Through their senior cadres in Syria, is a problematic issue for them. And the removal or the pulling out some of these non-Syrian figures from their key positions in Syria is a very legitimate demand. And it is something the YPG is open to discussing. So while a direct peace agreement or settlement between the YPG and Ankara might be very difficult to achieve in the time being because the political atmosphere is not ripe, specifically in Ankara, starting the process by building some confidence or pursuing some confidence-building measures like the removal of the PKK senior cadres from Syria is something the U.S. has leverage to do and has leverage to incentivize the YPG to pursue. And it is something that is going to address a huge part of Ankara's concern.
Yes.
Another thing that...
Yes, it's a very important point that you made. And sorry, I just interrupted, but go on with the other point that you mentioned in the report.
A second point that was also mentioned in the report, and I'll put forward what is expected from the YPG, but also it's important to put forward what is expected from Ankara in the process, but also the YPG insurgency in Afrin is something that is taking lives of innocent civilians, and it is just escalating the tensions between Ankara and the YPG. So this is something that the YPG leadership needs to understand, that it is counterproductive and it is not going to achieve any political gains for them. On the contrary. From Ankara, they also need to address the concerns of the native population of Afrin that have been displaced as a result of their military campaign there. This is something incredibly important for the YPG leadership. It is incredibly important for the Kurdish population there, and it is a very legitimate demand that needs to be addressed. A second thing that Ankara also could pursue in order, if they do look at this from a non-military perspective, trying to find a political solution, is the inclusion of the Syrian Democratic Council, the political arm of the YPG now, in the Geneva-led peace process. This is the only way to guarantee that, to mitigate any separatist agenda of the YPG, is to include them in multilateral arrangements where they become part of the Syrians, be it the opposition or the regime affiliated, but the Syrian peace talks, where the future of the northeastern Syria is determined through a multilateral agreement. So far, Ankara's veto over the process has been hindering any push for their inclusion. And I think this is a big mistake because it is going to push the area towards some sort of stalemate, or it is going to push them to an arrangement, perhaps
right
with Damascus or.
You also, we have a connection problem. Could you, we have a connection problem right now, but Darin, can you hear us? Okay, we have.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. So, could you also a little bit comment on, because you mentioned also that though maybe United States didn't intend it to be, but they created a YPG-led statelet by giving them the support and militarily and politically maybe in the northern Syria. How does the people living there is affected by this kind of, arrangement that is being YPG-led, living in a YPG-led statelet?
Right. I think just to the former part of your question, throughout the course of the anti-ISIS fight, Washington has been arguing that there was no alternative to the YPG in the fight against ISIS. And that could possibly be true, or could have possibly been true. But Washington also gradually realized that there are both local demographic consequences, but also geopolitical consequences to their support to the YPG. And as you said, the local population is a huge segment of it, because unlike northern Iraq, for instance, northeastern Syria is predominantly Arab and not Kurdish. And even in the Kurdish area, to assume that the majority of Kurds are politically aligned with the YPG is a common mistake people fall into. The YPG has a political project and a political agenda that is not necessarily aligned with the local population. That being said, they have been able to offer a degree of stability and security in northeastern Syria that I would say is mostly appreciated by the local population who had lived under ISIS for so many years. And then they were liberated by a force that they consider as outsiders, a force that has a political project different than the population. That being said, it is a force that was able to offer them that kind of protection. Also, a very important point that the local population associates the presence of the YPG with American protection, American air protection. And most of the population looks at Idlib and looks at other areas that is out of American protection and how much they're being bombarded by Russian and regime airstrikes. And they realize that the presence of the YPG offers that kind of air protection and air security. So it has its pros and it has its cons as well for the local population. Of course, a lot of people I meet throughout my trips in northeastern Syria, especially within the Arab communities, complain about how these senior YPG or PKK cadres control the most important aspects of governance in the area, and how they're the only decision makers and how they're incapable of devolving real power to the local community, and they don't trust the local community. But they also acknowledge that they have been able to offer a degree of stability. So it's very nuanced and it's very complicated. So I like to constantly put the pros and cons of their governance. That being said, I do think, and it's highlighted clearly in our report, that the YPG has to seriously take concrete measures to devolve governance powers to the local communities in Arab and Kurdish areas. They have to delegate authority to people not based on party loyalty. They have to be able to trust the local population more, train and be able to give them real power in order to sustain the current situation, in order to sustain the current stability in some areas and to stabilize other areas in eastern Syria that are currently facing more of a turmoil.
Could you also tell us a little bit more about how do you think, how could YPG willing to disconnect with the PKK-related cadres?
I tend to not use the word delink or dissociate because I do think the organic ties between the two institutions are very deep and complex and also quite opaque. So I tend to focus more on two things. One, pulling out the cadres. I'm not saying dissociation in terms of organizational ties, but sort of removing these specific individuals who are not from the areas in which they currently operate, and pulling them out, asking them basically to leave these areas and to devolve their current responsibilities to the local communities in these areas. When the YPG first entered predominantly Arab areas in Syria, they relied on their party cadres basically within the fighting force, on the front lines within the fighting force, but they also relied on them to set up emergency institutions to quickly stabilize post-ISIS areas. And they were very effective because they have a lot of organizational background. So they were sort of, they had a positive impact in that regard. My assessment now is that after many years of liberation post-ISIS, they are being counterproductive. They're causing a lot of problems locally because, as I said, the local population is consistently complaining about them dominating governance and dominating the decision-making process. And more importantly, they are causing geopolitical problems with Turkey. So their negative effect is like is much higher than their positive impact. Yeah. So I do think this is a step, again, to not use delinking or dissociation, but just pulling out these scatters from their locations is something the YPG is capable of doing without actually addressing more of the deeper organizational ties.
How likely do you think, given that still there are U.S. forces in the ground in northeast Syria, how likely do you think Turkey's an incursion by Turkey to the region? I mean, because Turkey is saying that, you know, our patience is not that unlimited.
Well, it's very difficult to anticipate what Turkey is going to do. What I could say is I think it would be incredibly politically problematic if Turkey pursues a ground incursion in northeastern Syria. American personnel continue to be on the ground in the northeast. The probability of something going wrong is very high. And Turkish-US relations are already quite strained. And such an act would really trigger a reaction from Washington.
And lastly, maybe I should ask about this one. Oh, can you hear us?
Especially from DoD and CENTCOM, from the military. Sorry, for a second. Can you repeat your question?
Sorry, we just for one moment we lost your voice, but my last question is regarding the ISIS fighters and the families that the YPG is in hold of in its parts. I mean, do you think the escalation of, how would the escalation of, a possible escalation of violence affect those people, the fighters especially? Is there a chance that they could be, released and go other parts of Syria or even maybe into Turkey?
No, absolutely. I think this is a huge problem. With or without a military escalation, it is a huge problem. The YPG currently has over 2,000 foreign ISIS fighters. They have around 70,000 people in a whole camp, including, I think, almost over 35,000 foreign families of ISIS fighters. And these numbers are huge in compared to the capacity of the YPG to actually deal with such a problem. So of course, there's a lot of fear of prison breaks. There's a lot of fear of the YPG pulling out resources to basically protect the northern border in case of a Turkish incursion or in case of a military escalation. So these are issues that not only the US, but the international coalition and the European allies are really concerned about. And they should, because the situation is very, very fragile and delicate in these areas. But even without a military escalation, as the report lays out, the issue of the foreign and Syrian ISIS fighter is something beyond the capacity of the YPG to address alone. So the YPG should not be expected to deal with such a huge problem without the support and without the intervention of the international coalition.
Darine Halifa, thank you very much. It was most enlightening, and our audience could find your report, which is on your internet site. Thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ashan. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Just bye.
Our guest was Darin Khalifa, Senior Analyst at the International Crisis Group, and we discussed her latest report regarding the situation in the northeast Syria. Thank you very much for watching us.